the thinking behind a withdrawal would be to pull those forces back across the river where they can much more easily be resupplied, backed up, but also could still have artillery reach across that river. And so if Ukrainian soldiers did take Kherson, they could then be sitting ducks for a huge Russian artillery barrage.
8 months ago, Russia occupied the Ukrainian city of Kherson. Now the Kremlin's military has announced the withdrawal of forces. The retreat could mark a major victory for Kyiv, but the Times reports there are concerns it could be a trap aimed at luring Ukrainian forces into urban fighting. Here to discuss the latest is Catherine Philp, the Times diplomatic correspondent. Catherine, welcome back to the programme. Lovely to have you.
Thank you.
Are we talking a sort of Trojan horse scenario? Is that what's been posited here?
Indeed. I mean, deception is one of the oldest forms of warfare, and this could be another go at it. It's Russia's quite adept at sort of muddying the waters, putting out information that isn't correct, and trying to create situations that are unanticipated. The difficulty with Kherson is we've sort of seen this go both ways. There are very good reasons why Russia might withdraw from Kherson. There have been signs of a kind of withdrawal. Certainly, more senior officers being taken out of that city, and less experienced reservists put in. There was an attempt to get quite a lot of civilians out of the city, which was sort of bound up with Russia's desire to essentially mass deportations of Ukrainians to areas that were more closely under Russian control, sort of to make Russian citizens out of them. So all of those things together have been going on over the last few weeks, and it can be very difficult to tell them from each other, especially as Russia also, when I was in that area about 10 days ago, cut off the internet from Kherson. So it became much harder for people inside the city to get information outside of what was really going on. So I think this caution we see from the Ukrainian side over what Russia's true intentions are is advised and not unexpected.
It's a hugely sort of significant city in terms of the war, because it was one of the first places that the Russians took. It's very close to the Russian border, and the Russians have been pulling out of other places and it not seemingly being a trap. So why have they decided to retreat now? What would be the reasons for the retreat now?
Well, if you look at both the significance of the area and the fact that they might have to retreat are sort of sides of the same coin. The reason for wanting to advance in this area, the fact they managed to do so quickly during the beginning of the war, was that there was a huge strategic imperative to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. And had they been able to keep going even further and hitting Odessa, they would have almost totally cut off Ukraine's coast. So they didn't manage that. They stopped around Kherson and never got further. But Kherson is positioned on one side of the Dnieper River, the main river in Ukraine, and it's on the western side. Now, this means that it's much harder to resupply. You're fighting essentially with a river at your back, which we've seen happen in a few other places, and so that as that area has shrunk and the Ukrainians have moved in towards Kherson, it's a smaller and smaller area that they're fighting from with their backs to a river. The thinking behind a withdrawal would be to pull those forces back across the river where they can much more easily be resupplied, backed up, but also could still have artillery reach across that river. And so if Ukrainian soldiers did take Kherson, they could then be sitting ducks for a huge Russian artillery barrage.
Catherine, in terms of the bigger picture of the war, Kherson is also, as I understand it, on the supply lines to Crimea for the Russians. And so if they really are withdrawing because they need to withdraw, as it were, rather than it being strategic, then it doesn't bode well for them in terms of, perhaps in the far future, their ambition to hang on to Crimea?
I certainly think that it brings complexity into that. Kherson is resupplied from Crimea, and Crimea obviously is not as accessible from the Russian mainland since the bridge there, the Kerch Bridge, was damaged. Um, for some reason, the Russians have put the Kerch bridge rebuilding deadline or when they aim to have it back in action, but to July next year. And if they can't respond a bit quicker than that,
They really are in trouble. Yeah,
they may
yeah,
well be
yeah,
in trouble, because
yeah.
I think one thing that's very noticeable in Ukraine is that when critical infrastructure like that is struck by the Russians, they move in very fast to repair it. So it's baffling to me that the Russians are allowing that to take so long.
Very interesting indeed, Catherine. I'm sure we'll have you back very soon as the picture continues to emerge of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. Catherine Philp, the Times diplomatic correspondent, thank you very much for joining me.